Joining us today is Jamie Benning with the Iowa State University Extension. I believe the Assistant Director of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Is that correct?
Yes.
And she's going to talk to us about water quality and nutrient reduction strategy. And she did pose a question in the chat, so if you haven't answered that yet, go ahead and then look for possible future questions in the chat as well.
All right. So is everybody seeing my PowerPoint?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, thank you all. It's great to be with you today. And I'm going to post this question one more time because sometimes when you join after it's posted, you can't see it. So I've added that again. So it's great to hear from you and where you reside, and that'll help me with as we have some discussion and get into some questions. So we're going to talk about water quality in Iowa today. As John mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director for Ag and Natural Resources Extension and formerly served in the Water Quality Program Manager role for 6 years prior to that. So I've worked a lot in Iowa, focused on water quality issues and working with farmers and landowners in watersheds and focusing on improving water quality in Iowa. So today we're going to talk about some of those challenges that we're seeing in the state. One of the large efforts that we have going on called the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy to help address some of those issues, how we're measuring progress of water quality and particularly the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And then I've left some time for questions, discussion, and some sharing of resources that I have for you to dig in a little bit deeper on water issues that we talk about today. So in Iowa, we're very fortunate to have very rich soils, high organic matter soils as a result of the tall grass prairie that was here before Iowa was settled. So it makes us, along with our favorable weather conditions in most years, favorable conditions for growing row crops in Iowa. Several decades ago, we transitioned from longer term rotations, rotations that included more small grains and alfalfa, more pasture on the landscape, to a primarily two crop system, corn and soybeans, where the majority of our cropland in the state is focused on those two crops. We've seen some decline in the quality of our soils because of that lack of diversity in the soil. The roots from those tall grass prairie plants and the alfalfa and small grain species aren't growing in a larger portion of the year as they used to be, and our shorter season row crops aren't capturing rainfall and covering our soil in those times of intense rainfall. So you see one photo here representing we see some heavier rainfall events now than more frequently or in larger quantities than we used to, and that seems to be increasing. So that is another challenge that we have. So while we're still very fortunate to have those soils, there are some leaks in that system that we have in order to help keep the soil in place, keep nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, within our crop fields and from leaching away to the subsurface or running off in heavy rainfall events. And fortunately, there are a lot of ways that we can address this that we'll talk about in a bit. So we often talk about big issues related to water quality being the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone, but we do also see local impairments here in Iowa. So this is a photo of the draft impaired waters list. So these are the water bodies, and you see the segments in orange and yellow, and those indicate water bodies or segments of streams that are not meeting their designated use. So what that means is they might be designated as a water source. Oops, that went too fast. Might be designated as a drinking water source. It might be a stream that's designated for human contact or primary contact, where families are in that water enjoying it. It might be a cold water trout stream, such as in Northeast Iowa, or it might be a warm water stream in Western Iowa. So all water bodies have their own designated use attached to them. And then there's criteria. And if they're not meeting them, then they end up on this 303D list of impaired water bodies. So this is the draft set of impairments for 2020. The DNR, Department of Natural Resources, submits this to the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and they are in that process of reviewing this list now. So you see we have a lot of water bodies in the state that are not meeting their designated use. Most of them usually are related to bacteria impairments, turbidity, which is sediment, washing off of the land, urban and rural, and causing issues. And it can also be nutrients that cause either biological issues. So the habitat for fish and other aquatic species is not where it should be. So those are the major issues in terms of impairments for our local water bodies. And then we hear a lot about the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. So the slide here shows the size of the hypoxic zone and its location in that lower picture for last year. A team of scientists goes out and takes samples throughout the Gulf and determines this area each year. So last year it was about 6,700 square miles, or about 11 Iowa counties, to give us a reference that makes sense to us here in Iowa. So I had the chance a couple of years ago to go down and meet with fishermen and shrimpers in the Gulf. And what struck me is that there's a lot of similarities between family fishermen and family farmers. And some concerns that they had is they need to go to different locations for their shrimping and fishing than they had to in the past because of the hypoxic zone. So they need to go to different areas where fish are still located in these areas in red and yellow. The oxygen is depleted because of nutrients coming down the Mississippi River and causing a low oxygen area called hypoxia, why it's called the hypoxic zone, and creating these areas that are not fishable for them at certain times of the year. So it really is affecting their family businesses and challenging them in terms of their industry in the Gulf. And then the two diagrams above are showing the loss of nitrogen on the left and the loss of phosphorus on the right from Midwestern states. And so just to give you an idea of where the majority of those nutrients are coming from, and Iowa being focused on agricultural row crop production, we are one of the top sources for nitrogen and among the top for phosphorus. Phosphorus tends to be lost from areas that are hilly and prone to erosion. Nitrogen is lost in areas that are tile drained and where nitrate leaches into those tile drainage systems, and also areas that are well drained as well. So just to give you a snapshot of hypoxia and the causes of that. So what's happening in Iowa to improve water quality? So I don't want to paint a completely difficult picture there. There are challenges that we have, but there are a lot of efforts going on in the state to improve water quality. One of those is the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. So this strategy started in about 2013. It really got going in 2013 and 2014. It is in response to the Gulf hypoxic zone that I showed you. All of the states in the Mississippi River Basin or Mississippi River watershed are required, that are along the main stem of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, to create a plan to address the loss of nutrients leaving their state. And our plan is voluntary, so there's no regulations tied to it. It is voluntary. It is science-based, so a team of scientists in Iowa got together, discussed how to put this together, what practices would be a part of this strategy. They focused on nitrogen and phosphorus and reducing our loss from the state by 45% for both nitrogen and phosphorus, with 4% of nitrogen and 16% of the phosphorus goal being from point sources, which are our cities and industries that have nitrogen and phosphorus leaving their factories or their wastewater treatment systems. And then the balance of that is assigned to non-point sources. So agricultural sources mainly, some city and construction sites, things like that, where a non-point pollutant is something that we know is occurring, we can measure it, but we can't point to one particular place where it's coming from. So there's a goal of 41% reduction for nitrogen from those non-point sources and 29% for phosphorus. And as I mentioned, we have a practice-based approach for addressing nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So the team of scientists identified different conservation practices that can be put in place in the field or at the edge of a field to minimize nitrogen and phosphorus loss. That same sort of practice approach was developed for point sources as well. And there's also a framework for innovation. So as we learn about new practices, they can be added to the nutrient reduction strategy practice list as well, as long as there's sufficient evidence to show that they work. So for non-point sources, for agricultural sources of nitrogen and phosphorus, the practices that were identified were categorized into three main groups. Those that can be placed within the field, and those include our normal changes to in-field operations like tillage and managing fertilizer, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. It also includes cover crops, as you see in the picture there. So changes that we can make within the field to have the right amount of fertilizer applied at the right time to minimize loss, reducing tillage as much as possible because that minimizes erosion, and then also placing a surface cover such as cover crops within the field. Now moving on to the edge of field, these are practices that either for nitrogen intercept tile drainage water and create an opportunity for denitrification. So taking that nitrate, converting it, and having some loss of nitrogen gas, but removing the nitrate and reducing the amount that will flow into a nearby stream or river. So bioreactors, saturated buffers, and wetlands are great examples of that, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. On the phosphorus side, edge of field practices include terraces, filter strips, buffer strips at the edge of a field and in between a field and a waterway. So those practices that capture sediment or filter sediment are edge of field practices for phosphorus. Land use change looks at any practice that would convert a row crop system like corn and soybeans or continuous corn to a more perennial system. So pastures would fall into this, longer term rotations where we're adding oats or alfalfa back in the system, or conservation reserve program or other programs or practices that would involve planting grasses or a mixture of species for a number of years versus that corn and soybean rotation. So generally speaking, our in-field practices, other than tillage, reducing tillage and adding cover crops, those have a fairly small impact. However, tillage can reduce phosphorus loss by a significant amount, reducing from conventional tillage to minimum or no-till can reduce sediment and phosphorus loss by over 50%, sometimes up to 90%. And cover crops can reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loss by about 30%. So those are very highly effective in-field practices. And then edge of field and land use change generally have much higher rates of effectiveness. So reducing loss usually by about 50% or more compared to a system without those practices. So what is Iowa doing to implement these practices? So one main effort that's been going on to increase practice use in Iowa and implement the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy is the Iowa Water Quality Initiative. So this map here represents the farm focused, the agricultural projects happening in the state. And you can see that there's a great distribution across the state and many different projects going on. The earlier projects that were implementing the nutrient reduction strategy were focused on getting farmers to try new practices and offering what's called cost share. So some incentive dollars to try different practices in the field, or covering the majority or a portion of the cost of an edge of field practice, as those get fairly costly. Several practices have been very popular in this, cover crops being one of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Urban folks can also be a part of the nutrient reduction strategy. So practices that can be installed to help minimize the flow of stormwater, leaving your yard, leaving urban areas. Many towns have installed stormwater wetlands or larger detention type basins or practices within the city, installing permeable pavers in their downtown areas to intercept water and reduce flash flooding events. So that's just a quick snapshot of what's been happening in towns as well. So this has really been an all-in approach to improving water quality. So cover crops has been one of the most popular new, I would say it's not a new practice, but it's been resurging and getting more popular recently. And farmers have been very interested in cover crops because of the ability to reduce erosion and phosphorus loss, to take up nitrate and keep it from leaching, and also to minimize weed pressure within the field. It also, over the long term, can increase soil organic matter, and which improves a lot of factors of soil health, water holding capacity, other factors. It also can serve as a forage source for those farmers that have cattle or other livestock that can graze it. And as I mentioned, it improves over the long-term soil health with long-term use. Another practice that's been popular is the bioreactor. So this is one of the edge of field practices that I talked about that intercepts tile drainage water leaving a field. And even though it sounds kind of sophisticated, what it is just a trench filled with wood chips. There's grass seeded over the top of it. It's not something you can farm over, but there are structures in place, as you can see here, to keep water flowing at a regular interval through that trench filled with wood chips. And in that trench, denitrification is happening. So nitrogen gas moves through the soil surface, through the soil pores and into the atmosphere. And the water coming through has about 50% less nitrate than it did if it would have not flowed through the bioreactor. There's mechanisms in place so that the water doesn't back up into the field. That's a big concern for farmers and landowners that are thinking about a bioreactor. And there's overflow valves and gates that allow that water to bypass if a heavy rainfall event occurs and there's a lot of tile drainage moving through. So that's the bioreactor, one of the relatively new practices. Another that's been around a long time, but scientists have worked out some ways to route tile into wetlands, a practice that has naturally occurred in Iowa, but with modifications can also reduce nitrate and be a very effective nitrate reduction practice. So tile drainage is routed into these wetlands that have some enhanced retention time. So keeping that water flowing through the wetland allows for denitrification to occur within that wetland pool, because there's bacteria in there breaking that down and releasing nitrogen gas as well. Reduces nitrate loss by about 50%, but also provides a lot of wetland habitat, some aesthetic benefits, and can have some long-term economic incentives as well. Say if this was an area that has been persistently wet for the farmer or landowner and causing some challenges in terms of farming that area. And there also can be some conservation payments for that footprint of the practice as well. And then saturated buffers was another relatively new practice, and it works similarly to a bioreactor, but the edge of field soil is used as a source for carbon versus the wood chips, and that drives that denitrification process. So similar structures are put in place to control water, but instead of moving it through that trench of wood chips, there's a lateral tile that's placed between the buffer and the field, and water slowly seeps into that buffer area and denitrification occurs. There's some wildlife habitat benefits in the buffer area, and there's quite a bit lower cost to the saturated buffer versus the bioreactor, although they don't work everywhere. So there needs to be certain types of soil, no sands or gravels where the water can quickly move into the subsurface, and the banks can't be too highly sloping or eroded. So these are great where they work in a lower cost option, but have some more characteristics that need to be in place for them to work. So there's a kind of an aerial view of a saturated buffer along a stream, and gives you an idea of where they're placed within a field. Field tile routing in, control chambers, and then the distribution tile that's placed laterally there along between the field and the buffer. All right, so how are we measuring progress with the nutrient reduction strategy, and are we making any progress? So the strategy is measured using a logic model approach. So we know ultimately on the very right-hand side there, we want to see changes in water. We want to see that 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus loss. To see that, we know we need changes on the land. We need to see significant increases in conservation practices and the city and industry practices going in for us to see that change in water. Prior to that happening, we know we need a lot of activity related to changing minds and attitudes toward conservation and increasing understanding and acceptance of these practices. So that's the human element. And then to make all this happen, there needs to be inputs. There needs to be people out doing education, funding in order to make that happen, in order to provide cost share funding for trying out these practices, agency resources and private sector resources to keep all this moving. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot of what we're measuring today, but know that there are pieces all along this continuum that we're measuring every year to detect change in each of these areas, and especially land and water, where we want to see those changes happen over time. So for land, one that I wanted to showcase was tillage practices. So in some parts of the state, we've seen quite an increase in the use of reduced tillage or no-till. So on the left here, we have no-till as a percent of row crop acres. So very popular practice in Northeast Iowa, in Western Iowa and Southern Iowa, where the ground is hilly and prone to erosion, and those practices really work well in those areas. Where no-till isn't taking off, you can see in Central Iowa, not as popular, but where those practices aren't popular, you see on the conservation tillage map that we have about 20 to 60% coverage in some watersheds in Central Iowa using conservation tillage. So this is an indicator to us that it has shifted over time. We see increases in no-till, increases in conservation tillage away from the more intense continuous conventional tillage that we've seen in the past. So this is a good indicator for phosphorus loss. Cover crops have also been growing in popularity. Similarly, we're seeing in those hillier parts of the state, cover crops take off and seeing more interest there. These areas also align where we have more livestock that are grazing. So cover crops can be used as a forage in addition to their water quality and soil erosion and soil health benefits. So some of the areas of the state where those, that have those characteristics are seeing upwards of 10 to 15 or even more percent of their row crop acres using cover crops. So that's a positive sign as well. Bioreactors and saturated buffers are relatively new. So started out at the beginning of the strategy with only a handful of these practices on the landscape, and most of them were related to research. So it's great to see that we have increased those over time. We're about 100 of those practices on the landscape. A lot of them are in your neck of the woods. They're in the North Raccoon watershed. We have really active watershed projects throughout the North Raccoon, and these practices have been pretty popular among farmers and landowners, especially those early adopters that are interested in new technologies and trying out new practices. So you see over time, we've really started to bump up, but we need a lot more of these on the landscape. And then the nitrate removal wetlands that I showed, these have been a part of a conservation reserve and enhancement program, or CREP, for a number of years before the strategy began, but also has remained popular, and farmers and landowners with the possibility of putting these kinds of wetlands on their farms, the interest has been high for these large wetland practices. And again, the North Raccoon and Central Iowa area, where we see a lot of tile drainage, is where we see a lot of these practices and a lot of interest beyond the amount of funding that is available. So it's great to see those increase as well. So although we've seen all those increase compared to where we need to be, we're making a lot of progress, but still have a long way to go in terms of some of these practices. So this is one scenario. The goals along the right-hand side represent one scenario that will, if all of these practices are in place at these number of acres or number of practices, we will achieve the nitrogen and phosphorus goals of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. So for no-till, we're getting around that 7 million acre mark of a goal of 10.5 million acres. So getting really close to that goal and seeing a lot of progress. However, we have been working since the 80s, on improving, reducing tillage intensity, increasing no-till. So it shows that dedication to these efforts does pay off, but it can take a while. Cover crops, we're about 1 million acres on the land right now, with a goal for this particular scenario being 12.5 million. So we've seen a lot of growth, from 10 or so thousand acres when the nutrient reduction strategy began to over 1 million now. So we've made a lot of progress in those years, but have a long way to go. For the edge of field practices like wetlands, bioreactors, and saturated buffers, we're really just getting started on those. So a lot of us here at Iowa State are focusing a lot of our efforts on education around wetlands, bioreactors, and saturated buffers, discussing how they work, their cost, where they fit on the landscape, and promoting folks that can help with the technical questions, the design, and getting them on the ground. So that is a big focus of ours, because we do have a long way to go on those nitrate removal practices. And prairie strips is a great practice that fits within our agricultural systems and provides sediment and nitrogen reduction. And we have about 3,700 acres of those on the landscape right now. So as I had a mix of folks saying that they're living on a farm or are a town resident, or maybe a combination, maybe live in town now, but still are a landowner or a farmer as well. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what can I do? So we all have a role to play is my main message here. No matter if you live in town or are a farmer or landowner on a small number of acres or thousands of acres, there's something that we can all do to improve water quality in the state. So first and foremost, keeping soil in place, keeping it covered as much of the year as possible, either through perennial crops or adding a cover crop, reducing tillage. When we live in town, getting grass established as soon as we can, minimizing those areas that erode is one thing that we can do. Using ISU recommendations for fertilizer management, whether in urban areas for your lawn or in farming systems for corn and soybeans, using recommended rates can help us minimize loss right at the start. And then I ask everyone to consider the edge of field practices that you might include. So for a yard, that might be some perennial plantings in your yard. It might be a rain garden that captures runoff from your roof and downspouts. And for farmers, it's some of the practices that we talked about, the wetlands, bioreactors, and soil conservation practices. So to learn more, I'm going to put a few more resources here in the chat once I get done, but ISU Extension has had many virtual education opportunities. Iowa Learning Farms is a group that has weekly had webinars and periodic virtual field days. So even now, before we can get out and before it's safe to be out in large groups yet, there are opportunities to learn more about these practices. So I encourage you to go there. And then every county has a Natural Resources Conservation Service or Soil and Water Conservation District office that's aligned by county in the state. And folks there have the technical expertise and knowledge of the different watershed projects or federal or state funding programs that are available to farmers and landowners to use in order to try practices out or to cover the costs of those edge of field practices, usually at least half and sometimes more. So I encourage everyone that is a farmer or landowner to visit your NRCS or Soil and Water Conservation District office for those kinds of opportunities. And then 2 other plugs here. I worked with a team, the Conservation Learning Group here on campus, to create what we call the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual, because we know I only covered a snapshot of the practices that are available, and there are many, many more, and sometimes it's difficult to know where to start. So this manual is especially helpful for those maybe somewhat new to conservation practices or helping someone with those decisions. So I'll put that in the chat, the link to this, but this is a very comprehensive manual that goes through in-field, edge of field, and land use change practices that help address our conservation and water quality concerns. And then I also will have a link to those urban conservation practices. So those of us, me included, that live in town and also have a responsibility to manage water and nutrients leaving our lawns, there's some information on those practices as well. So I would welcome any questions. I'm going to stop sharing and open it up and add a few of these resources in the chat while you folks are thinking.
Thank you, Jamie. I think you'd be interested to know that one of our Rotary projects that we've been working on the last couple of years and trying to put all the details together is put a rain garden in our elementary school.
Wonderful. Yeah,
And it started as an outdoor classroom, and then we started talking about the water drainage issues. We got a long ways to go because it's a much more difficult process, much more complex than we thought. But that is something that is on the docket. Hopefully in the next year or two, we can put all the funds together and get all the agencies lined up to get that accomplished.
Yes. Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, those are no small task. And when you need to, incorporate a lot of different stakeholders into those decisions and projects. So that's great that's coming together.
Jamie, I have a question.
Sure.
We're mostly rural here in Greene County. Every time water quality comes up, particularly with the county supervisors reference hog confinements and that, they are primarily farmers and they all say, oh no, city people contribute more than farm people do. You all fertilize your lawns, and the one in particular insists that city dwellers are worse than farmers. What's the balance as far as the stuff getting into the water system, city versus rural?
So for non-point source, so just thinking about the lawn fertilizer question, it's really a very, very small portion, in terms of those nutrients applied to lawns versus those applied to farm fields, for agricultural production. So maybe those that are managing the most intensely, let's say golf courses, those folks that really are intensely managing their lawns and applying fertilizer. Even those, I've calculated that out. It's still below an Iowa State recommended rate for growing a corn crop. So, and then the scale is the next part of that. So we only have about 1 to 2 million acres and that's being really generous, of lawns and turf grass and golf courses in the state compared to, 26 to 30 million acres of agricultural production. And then, that scale that down to about 24 million or so of corn and soybeans. So yes, folks, I include myself in that. I apply fertilizer to my lawn so that it grows adequately, but no, it is acre for acre and pound for pound is not the same intensity of nutrient application compared to growing a corn or soybean crop.
Well, that's what Logic was telling me. So thank you for
Yeah, and
confirming.
I get that question a lot and did that calculation just so I was answering that truthfully and to the best of my ability.
Two questions.
Oh, yep, Gerald.
You mentioned drain tile several times.
Mhm.
In the last couple of decades, at least, we've seen extensive tiling.
Yes.
And I wonder what your thoughts are, what recommendations are about continued or more tiling or less tiling. That's one question. Second question is, once you recapture or secure nitrogen and phosphate in wetlands or in other barriers, is there a way to replenish it back to the soil?
So yeah, tile intensity is an issue. We have heavier rainfall. We've had that intensity increasing for the past several decades, and we see that trend continuing. So from a crop management standpoint, I understand the increase in tile that we see. From an economic standpoint, it makes sense. It does present us with water quality challenges. It also presents us an opportunity to, when those new acres of tile go in or a more intense level of drainage is added, when those are updated, it gives us a chance to think, where does a conservation practice fit within this either increased number of acres of drainage or increased intensity of drainage of acres. So I think a lot of drainage districts are starting to think more about that. Where do we put wetlands within the drainage district to capture some of this water as it's being drained, and where does that fit within our system? Where does it, I see farmers that do it on a small scale, might have an area that's been a problem for them in terms of drainage for a number of years. They decide to leave that as a wetland, and it helps the rest of their farm in terms of drainage, because that might have been an area that was kind of backing up the system at times in certain larger rainfall events. So I think we need to think more in a system, not just a short term, what do we do to fix this one problem, but set back and what do we do to address a collection of problems that we have here. I think you had a couple questions there. Did I get the second phase of your question?
Recapturing.
Recapturing, right. Right, so denitrification, no, because when the nitrates flow into a wetland or bioreactor or saturated buffer, we're not collecting them or trapping them. It's converting them to a nitrogen gas and going into the atmosphere. So there's nothing there to capture and put back on the land. Phosphorus, if we're getting sediments that build up within, behind a terrace or in a filter strip, I suppose you could, during maintenance, kind of put those back, disperse them out on the landscape, because what you've captured there is your rich topsoil and some of the fertilizer that's been applied. So it could be, but not really routinely can we capture that and think of them as a fertilizer source. It's mainly just finding a place for that sediment that we're cleaning out from a practice. I think Rick.
Yes, Jamie,
Sure.
on your discussion of measurables, you talked about how you can quantify the number of farms that have certain practices and so forth, but you didn't talk about actually measuring the percentage of reduction in the effluent. That's, municipals have to do that.
Yes,
and
they
they're
do.
penalized if they don't. Is anybody measuring on a macro basis the effluent, and if so, how far along is the state on its goal of reducing, say, nitrogen by 45%?
So from the non-point sources, there is a lot of monitoring going on, both at a large scale, our ambient network, where we have monitoring stations placed throughout the state. We have the most intensely monitored state in the in the hypoxia task force states. There's also a lot of measurement going on at a smaller scale. So at a small watershed project scale, usually in the 20 to 30,000 acre range. And then also for verification of practices and for research purposes at the edge of field or at the edge of a practice as it's installed. So as I showed you, the diagrams about a bioreactor or saturated buffer, a lot of those early on were monitored so that we could better understand their effectiveness. So yes, we're monitoring water at a lot of different scales, from the edge of practice to edge of field to small up to large watershed. Unfortunately, no, we're not seeing a reduction yet in nitrate loss in the state. So that's something where we still need to do a lot of work. We know that those practices are effective from our edge of field monitoring. And we know if you increase the intensity and number of acres covered with cover crops and number of practices capturing tile drainage, that we expect to see at a larger scale those reductions, but we haven't put enough of those practices out on the landscape yet to see that start to show up in our larger scale monitoring. On the phosphorus side, we've started to see some of those reductions. From a modeling standpoint, we know that the reduction in tillage that we've seen, the reduction in tillage intensity, the increase in no-till practices have done a lot to reduce our phosphorus loss and sediment loss from the field edge and delivered to the stream. There's still a lot of stream bank erosion that happens. So we're still getting a better understanding of how to better measure the contribution of stream bank erosion and slumping of stream banks into streams. So that is still a big challenge. But from a practice standpoint, we've made quite a bit of progress from the phosphorus side of things from the field edge. So hopefully that answers your question. It's not a simple one. and there's a lot of monitoring going on to help track this over time.
Amy?
Sure.
Seems like we've been hearing a lot about the volunteer programs for many, many years, but yet when you showed some of the graphs, I mean, some of the progress was barely even visible on the graph. Somebody mentioned a lot more tiles going in, and that's because when those tiles go in, they can grow more crops on those lands. And so are we going to have to do something beyond a voluntary thing like rewards or penalties? Or I mean, it seems like at the present pace, we're never going to get to our goal.
Yeah, with some simple math and looking at where we need to be, especially on the nitrogen side, it doesn't take a long time, to do a back of the envelope calculation and see that it's going to take many years. So I think all of the options that you proposed are on the table. Right now we are in a voluntary system, but I can also understand from the state's perspective and, beyond that, a voluntary system will only work so long, and we need to see some folks stepping up and volunteering, for those practices. I think we've seen a lot of growth, like I said, on the soil conservation side, the reduced tillage, the soil conservation practices. Cover crops, have grown a lot in popularity. So we're seeing a lot of movement there, but for those edge of field and particularly those focused on nitrate reduction, those do need to increase a lot more, to get to where we need to be. I've even seen, for the most part, if a landowner wants to install one of those practices, there is little to no money coming out of their pocket. So we're at the point still where there's interest from the part of the agencies and different entities involved that they really want to get more of these on the landscape so that farmers see it, in their neighborhood. They can go out and kick the tires, call on a neighbor and ask how things are going for them with that practice. Chris, you had your hand up. I'd like to just open this up for more discussion.
Yeah, just on that same topic, about the little slice of cover crops and other practices versus how many that are requested. How far would you say percentage-wise we're past the early adopter stage? Are we?
It's hard to say. I think cover crops and no-till and reduced tillage, those can fit those adopter curves pretty well because you can try them out. You can put them on a few acres and see how they go. The others, you're all in, and it's really difficult and costly to tear out a saturated buffer or bioreactor once you've put it in. So I think it's hard to compare those two. I do see the farmers and landowners that are adopting the edge of field practices are those early adopters, those innovators, those that are interested in technology. Whereas the cover crops and tillage practices, those fit into a system a bit differently. So I don't see them as thought of as maybe technologies, even though they are. They're more of a practice that fits into a system. They've been around for a long time. Kind of rambling, but
Yeah, but 1 million acres of covers in X amount of acres of doesn't seem very far into
no,
it.
no. Yeah, it's
Minimum,
about 4 to 5.
looks like minimum till and is much more accepted.
Yes, yeah, and that is part of it. What is the norm in your area? We see parts of the state where cover crops are really popular. A handful, like I showed you the North Raccoon, 20 saturated buffers and bioreactors within, that spread throughout a fairly large watershed. But you get to the point where there's more than one in a county, and you've probably met that farmer and know who that is that has adopted that practice. So the more we see that, I think the faster the adoption will start to happen, because when you know somebody that's done it, it starts to be less, unknown and not taboo, but just it's something that's more commonplace, and it starts to become part of the culture of your area to have these practices on farmland.
Thank you.
Sure. Gerald.
Another question. One of your recommendations regarding Iowa State Extension was fertilizer management. But you didn't talk a lot about fertilizer.
I didn't. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear you speak more about the use of fertilizer and reduction in use.
Sure. So we don't have one recommended rate for row crop production. For Iowa, we have what's called the maximum return to nitrogen rate, or the corn nitrogen rate calculator. And what that calculator does is take into consideration the price of corn, the price of that nitrogen fertilizer, and calculates what will give you the best return on your investment. So I think a lot of focus on nitrogen management or fertilizer rates has been focused on yield in the past and a yield goal. And what this calculator does is looks more at how do you get the best return on your investment in nitrogen fertilizer. And like all tools, it's not perfect, but what that helps to calculate is a rate that is, it looks at your bottom line more so than producing a number of bushels and in the economics of it. And then we also recommend applying nitrogen as much as possible, or moving from fall to spring, or at least splitting up applications so that you're moving as much nitrogen close to the time that the crop will need it as possible. So, we see a lot of Nitrogen still going on as anhydrous in the fall, and much of that's going in with nitrification inhibitors that can keep that nitrogen in a stable form that's not as vulnerable to loss. So that is a plus, that has been developed over the past several years and a technology available to farmers. But moving to spring and even applying at planting or side dressing after the corn crop has emerged are all recommendations to help move the timing, and not as much about specifics, but or prescriptions, I should say, but just continuously improving and moving more of that nitrogen to early season or in-season application.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Jamie.
All right, thank you.
It's great to have you.
Yeah, I'd welcome any questions that you have. I'll put my email in the chat just